Good morning, everyone, and good to be associated with this platform this morning, and good to see you all. Thank you for being part of this and coming to listen. I think what necessitated my article actually arose from practice. It arose from experience. So I'm based in the UK. I moved from Nigeria to UK about 21 years ago, and I'm one of those people that moving to the UK, I've intentionally sought to work in cross-cultural mission. And what that means is I've decided to not just limit my ministry to Nigerians or Africans in Europe, but to work with the global church, as it were. And so one of the things I did earlier on was to lead what I would describe as a white majority church. In the UK context. And so the spaces I work in could probably be described as white spaces. Again, I can unpack that for people, in that sense. But one of the churches I led was a white majority church. And I realized some of the challenges that was involved in that, working in sort of white organization and spaces for those of us who are Africans or from the majority world in terms of collaboration, some of the challenges that we face. And I think as I was pastoring this church, the idea was to help the church to be diverse because it was in London, and it begs the question why you still have a white church in London when London itself is very diverse and very multicultural. And so I started that journey asking critical questions in the church. And not long after that, I realized that a lot of people started leaving the church. And what is interesting is that no one really came to me and said, well, we're leaving because you now become the pastor. No one ever said that to me. Everyone had genuine excuses to leave. But all I knew was that a lot of people were leaving the church and the church was getting smaller. Now, by the way, I was the first Black person to lead this church in its 10 years history. In that sense, just to put that there. But then, as I started asking these questions, a lot of things came up. For the few Africans and African Caribbeans in the church, some of them actually started to voice that they won't invite their friends to the church because they don't feel safe or secure in that sense. So that raised a lot of questions in the church about, okay, what are we doing around how we work together? Diversity, how do we, in that sense? So it raised a lot of people. I remember speaking to someone speaking to me from the church who was like, "What? These people have been in the church for such a long time. They've never said anything like this." So I said, well, maybe because they didn't feel safe enough to say it, but now maybe because I'm the leader, they feel safe to say it, or they identify with the leadership that there's someone there that represents us or look like us in that sense. And so that conversation continued in that sense, but I was there for about 2.5 years. So after a while, it became quite tricky. I had to ask myself the question, if I continue to lead this church, what is the cost? What is the price of helping this church to be diverse, to reflect the diversity of London? And I think my answers to that was like, it would be too costly to help this church because I will lose my whole Africanness in the whole process. I will lose my entire self because it was becoming obvious that when I preach in the church, it was very different to when I preach outside the church because I was more confident outside the church, another context, whereas in the church, I didn't have that level of confidence to articulate certain things. And so so it became, even some of the leaders in the church observed those dynamics because they came to see me preach in another church and they were like, you don't preach like that in our church. What's going on? So they started to pick some of that up in that sense. And so that experience led me to start doing some further research and ask questions. Is it possible for those of us in the majority world, particularly Africans, to lead Europeans, to lead Americans? Is it possible? And yes, it is possible. But I think it comes at a price.
Okay.
I think it comes at a So this is the background to writing that paper. In that sense, it came out of experience and then later research, just asking the question. But I'll add this, TK, and then we can continue the conversation. Now that Africa holds the largest concentration of Christians in the world, that is, we have what I would describe as the representative and the majority of Christians in the world. The continent is growing with Christianity. What is the implication of that for global leadership? And how do we lead in a global space with some of the challenges that I've just presented? So yeah, I'll leave it there and then we can continue that conversation.
Yeah, no, thank you. What you just said now, if you remember when we were in Dubai together for the Majority World Christian Leader Consultation, the lady who is the contemporary of Professor Foley of TFON, from Argentina, Marian.
Yeah.
She said something. She said the number has shifted, but the power still remains. That really struck me.
Yeah.
The number has shifted, but the power still remains.
Yeah.
Because you just mentioned about the majority world, mostly Africa. When you talk about number of Christian and believers, we are ahead of the rest of the world. So within that context now, I want you to just please explain what you mentioned two keywords, which I believe that we need to clarify for better understanding. Multicultural and intercultural.
Right. Okay.
Will you bring the two together, Dan, and for understanding, please?
Sure. Yes. So, in a Western context, multicultural, we'll be talking about a diversity of a congregation. Again, this is applicable to different parts of the world where you go. For example, in Africa, you go have different tribes, different people international gathering together. Or in the case of Asia, you could have a mixture of that as well. So multicultural churches lends itself to diversity. We have 45 nationalities, or we have different tribes or different people in this church. So it lends itself to representation. But then the question an intercultural church will ask is this: okay, now that you have all these people represented here, what does that actually mean for the church? How does that translate into the governance of the church? How does that translate into the leadership of the church? How does that translate into the worship of the church? And so multicultural churches, they kind of stay at that level of just being happy to display flags, to say we have all nations here, we are a diverse congregation. It's almost sometimes like a tick box exercise in that sense. Or a leadership might say, we have Africans, we have Asians on our board. But are those people free to challenge and to change the structures? Or are they just there just to represent a seat in that sense? Whereas in an intercultural, you are moving towards what I would describe as mutual inconveniencing. And what that means is that everybody is inconvenienced. What that means is that Europeans are inconvenienced, North Americans are inconvenienced, Africans are inconvenienced, because we are all trying to integrate. We are all trying to create something new, something that Paul describes in Ephesians chapter 2, which Andrew Walls, a professor of world Christianity, would describe as the Ephesian moment. That is, we are the Jews and the Gentiles, they are creating a new humanity in Christ. That is, we are trying to fashion and create something new. And we don't actually know where this is going to lead, but we know that we are on this journey together. So there is, in an intercultural space or context, shared reality. In a multicultural context, there is parallel reality. So it's possible to coexist in a multicultural context, but that doesn't mean that life is shared together or the challenges are shared together. In fact, sometimes I will argue that in a multicultural context, some people suffer more than the other. And what I mean by that is that some people sacrifice more than the others. They are always the one giving. They are always the one being asked to forgive. They are always the one being asked to step up, whereas the others are kind of like the benchmark, that people have to aspire to in that sense. So those are the distinctions that I will make around a multicultural an intercultural context. And I think this is applicable not just in Europe or North America, but in different parts of the world. And I'll give you an example. So when I look at some of the churches in Nigeria, even though Nigeria has, a lot of people groups and so on, but depending on which region you are, some churches, they have Hausas, Yorubas, and Igbos, but yet the dominance is still the Yorubas.
Exactly.
So again, it's this kind of thinking that even when we have churches that has different tribes, which tribe is still leading, which tribe is still used as the benchmark, or which language are we using in our conversations? Is it a language that privileges one community over another, or are we engaging a kind of a multilingual to express different concepts and ideas? So those are my distinctions.
Well, no, thank you for that because, and I'm glad that you related it to not only even among the white, but also even within the Africa context. Even in countries, you see a particular tribe is the head of the church, and you see 80% of the member and leadership, they are from his tribe. So this speaks to the fact that this is more of human element. It's what the kind of the way we are wired and formed. So I want you to expand this to even beyond the religion. Is it not the same reality in the professional world? What you are referring to as issue of despite the fact that we call it ourselves intercultural society, yet we bring in some people of different color just as a flag.
Yeah, I think this is applicable in workspaces because I think what has actually happened in society in different parts of the world is that there is something now called cultural intelligence, which is become a certified training that a lot of corporate organizations do. And the reason why they do that is because they realize that diversity is a gift, that diversity is something that needs to be cherished and nourished, even in the workplaces. So many corporate organizations, they will ask their staff to go on training around cultural intelligence. They are cultural intelligence coach and certifiers. But that is in recognition of the fact that even companies want to thrive at the back of diversity and belonging. They want to create a space that their workforce is able to embrace diversity from different parts of the world in that sense. And I think increasingly, in fact, I may want to argue, and this is controversial here, that I think secular society has even done better to some extent on this than the church. And the reason why I'm saying this is because there are some good practices that I think many organizations globally have espoused, like the training that I mentioned. In some other places, they will talk about equality, diversity, and inclusion, of different, whether that is class or tribes or people groups, whatever caveat, or caste, depending on which context you find yourself in. They will talk about that and implement strategies. Suppose why I'm saying this, that secular spaces might have even done this better than the church, is because in secular spaces, they have parameters to even measure success or failures. They put things in place, like they put evaluation in place. They put training in place. They send staff to go to training and so on. So they have KPIs to measure whether they are functioning well in cultural intelligence. Whereas I think for the church, yes, we rely on the Holy Spirit. We rely on God to bring conviction, but I think sometimes we use that as an excuse for inactivity. We use that as an excuse for not measuring progress and anything like that. So we just kind of, oh, as the Spirit leads. Yes, I believe in the Holy Spirit. I'm a Nigerian Pentecostal at heart, even though I'm also an English Baptist now, but my Pentecostalism is still very much with me. So I believe in the Spirit. I believe in the Spirit leading us and guiding all that we do and not relying on secular parameters. But I think if we are going to develop a radical inclusive communities, either in the church context, theological context, or mission agency context, we need intentionality. There are some contexts I've been in where people are just praying for diversity to happen. And I say, okay, that's good because I believe in prayers. I'm a man of prayer. But if you only pray and you are not intentional, now let's take a case from the Bible, Acts of the Apostles, chapter 6. Something happened. The church, when it started on the day of Pentecost, started mostly with Jewish background believers who were born in the land of Israel and those who were in the diaspora. So hence when they heard the disciples speaking in different languages, they were perplexed and they became part of the church. The Bible says 3,000 were added to the church. The diversity that the church started with, you begin to see the implications in Acts chapter 6. Because the beginning of Acts chapter 6, something happened. It says that the Grecian Jews complained because they felt marginalized. So they felt marginalized by the Hebraic Jews, that is, the Jews who were born in the land of Israel. They were the dominant ones, and the Jews that were born in the Greco-Roman world, who were born in the diaspora, to use that term, they felt marginalized. And so the apostles say, okay, we cannot let this distract the ministry of the word in prayer. Select among yourselves people who can look into this matter. And when you look at the people that were selected, if you study the names, you reveal something very fascinating. Because all those names were Greek names. And so the intentionality of the New Testament church was that there was a problem. There was a complaint from the Grecian Jews background. The solution that they put on the table was that a significant representation from that community became the first deacons or the first servants of the church. In that, Stephen, Philip, you look at the other names, they were Jews, but they had that Greek background in that sense. So what I'm simply saying is that the intentionality has to be there. And the New Testament church demonstrated that even though there were certain competencies that they talked about, they said people who are filled with the Spirit, who are filled with wisdom, so they didn't compromise on the fruit of the Spirit or on certain gifts of the Spirit, but yet they were still intentional. So it's possible to do that, to not compromise on the gifts of the Spirit and calling and vocation, but yet at the same time to be very intentional.
Yeah. No, I thank you for that, because in your article you really address the issue of intentionality, and I will come back to that, because that is where you are not giving the after you diagnose, then you are not giving the kind of solution which you mentioned, 4 areas that need to be engaged. So meanwhile, before I just want to say to the people on the platform, this is a conversation. Oh, I've seen Dr. Julia's hands already. This is conversation. I want you to be ready to jump in if you have any question. Yes, I've some question that I want to take on with our today's speakers, but this is open to us also to able to intercept and ask questions as seem fit. So before I go into the next question, and that next question, I want you to take us into something which I pick in your article. I will give Dr. Julius support to come on shortly, but I want you to discuss something with us, which you alluded in your article.
Okay.
This we address the issue because Africans, we always claim or think that we are the one being victimized over the years. And the way you break it down, what the Asians have gone through, what the Latin America have gone through, it's really opened my eyes. I say, wow. All along, we always say, we are they did this to us. But Asians, they have their own share. Latin America have their own share. But before I come to that, you know already what I'm trying to, where I'm going with that question. Dr. Julius, please come on board and share with us what you have in mind.
Good morning, everybody.
Good morning.
Good morning.
I just want to bring in some aspect that will also be very important. We are talking of cross-cultural. And it's not just about color of the skin. I spent about the same time as Israel spent. I was based in Kenya, serving the churches in Africa. To serve the churches, multi-denominational, is an experience.
Yeah, indeed.
And I was a Nigerian living in Kenya. And I was in an organization that is called Korat Africa. I got there because they said we are serving the whole of Africa and there was no West African in our staff. There was no West African in our staff, and we say we are serving the whole of Africa. That's how I was brought in. And the moment I entered, Potiphar's wife said, this Hebrew servant, that labeling, I got it from the first day. This Nigerian.
Hey.
And whether he went into the public vehicle or everywhere, I am picked up by my accent. Simon Peter was told, your accent betrayed you. But interestingly, I was served in the church. One thing is I was accepted serving in the various denominations. Catholic, Pentecostal, Orthodox, all sorts. The 4 blocks of the African church. I was serving them, and somehow I was accepted, but when I sit down with individual, I am this Nigerian. In fact, I was a member of the think tank of the church that midwifed the Kenyan constitution in 2010. I was accepted to that level. But when I sit with individual, it's this Nigeria. And whatever I say is read from the point of this Nigerian talk. So when we are talking of acceptance in multicultural, intercultural, I want us to say it's beyond just the color of the skin.
Yeah.
I went from country to country. I was accepted. In fact, I served Rwanda at a time when it was very sensitive. I served the top government, and people were afraid for me. But I was accepted, in fact, received by the vice of the country. And I served the top country, the top leaders in fact, they were happy that it is an African that was sent to meet them, not a white person. But when it comes to individuals, it's this Nigeria. Let's pick that up. And what does that mean?
Thank you, Dr. Julius. I think for those of us who have opportunity to serve outside our countries, I think we all able to identify with you, Dr. Julius, and able to as to what Dr. Dr. Israel also was.
No, I think I appreciate that case study. I think that's very important. That it's not just about skin color. It's about countries, it's about nations, nationalities, but also sometimes it's about theological differences. Again, what was illustrated about, in denominations. So I work across denominations in my work with the Evangelical Alliance here in the UK. And some of the challenges around unity, is interdenominational challenges. How sometimes, to use an example, Pentecostals are very skeptical of Anglicans, and Anglicans are very skeptical of Pentecostals. And so working together becomes problematic. Anglicans or Baptists will look at Pentecostals and be like, oh, you are all preaching prosperity gospel. But that's a stereotype, isn't it? Because, not all Pentecostals are preaching prosperity gospel in that sense. And then Pentecostals will look at Anglicans and Baptists and say, you have all embraced sexual liberality. And again, that's not the case. There are many Anglicans and Baptists who have a traditional view around marriage. So I think these issues, they cut across different aspects, whether it's nationality, theology, denomination, class in the European context, as we've been talking, and tribes in other places and caste in other places. So it's when you are crossing culture, you have to always be. I'll give you an example, and then we can move on to another conversation. One of the first churches I led in the UK, one of actually the main challenges I faced, even though this church was very mixed with Africans, African Caribbeans, and Europeans in it. But one of the greatest challenges we faced was the style of worship. And what I mean by that is that there were people in the church who came from a sort of a Catholic background, and Baptists who definitely wanted the worship to be quiet, but the way they understand worship is singing and reflecting on hymns. And there were those who came from a Pentecostal charismatic background who their understanding of worship is not to be quiet. And so it became a problem in the church. Now, some people prefer it to be quiet and reflective, and whilst others prefer it to be more loud and expressive. So what I had to do in that situation was to preach several sermons saying, actually, it doesn't matter what your preference of worship is. What matters is how you treat that other person that you think has a different style of worship to you. That can we respect each other? Let's respect those who want it more expressive, and let's respect those who want it more quiet and reflective. Because at the end of the day, we are all trying to worship God together in that sense. So again, I'm illustrating that to say sometimes it's actually our theology, or sometimes how we see certain things that brings the challenge in that sense.
Okay, good. No, thank you, Dr. Israel. I've seen quite a number of questions being raised. We have another hands there. I will ask Pastor Moses, will you please unmute yourself and ask your question direct? Pastor Moses? Then I will come to Molekau from Lesotho.
Okay, sir. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you loud and clear.
Yes, I've written it here. I said,
Okay.
sir, how do we deal with the definition of tribalism and multiculturalism in Christendom, and not use spirituality to ignore the challenges that raise problems in the Church of God?
Okay.
Thank you very much. I think tribalism is a big one, particularly on our continent, because I think so I'm going to go a bit deeper, and this might cause trouble. So today we're having a lot of conversations. So ready for this? Today we're having a lot of conversations, and I think the challenge we have is we always blame Europeans for our division. and say, oh, they divided us because of colonization. Yes, I agree. I've written a lot about that. Yes, colonization caused a lot of problems for us. And this year is the 140 years since the scramble for Africa, the partitioning and the colonization of Africa that started in 1884, 1885, when there was a conference in Berlin, to partition Africa. There was no single African chief or tribal leader in that meeting in Berlin. So Africans didn't know their continent was going to be carved. So I understand that. But before Europeans came, Africans were tribal. We were in our own separate kingdoms. African had kingdoms and empires all across the continent. And these are huge kingdoms and empires. But many of those kingdoms and empires, they function on tribalism. And so if you study many of this history and kingdoms, there were several wars being fought by Africans. Europeans were not involved in those wars. It was Africans killing Africans because of tribalism, because of, so because of the way we saw each other. You speak a different language, you have a different tribal mark, everybody was carving their own territory, as it were. So people were fighting. When Europeans came, they saw that and capitalized on it in several ways. So what I'm simply saying is that this tribal thing on the continent goes deeper. And so when we are going to begin to address African problem, we need to address colonization, but we also need to address tribalism, which continues to linger, so that people from one country might not want to marry another country. So, for example, I've heard in places where Nigerians will say, oh, I can't marry a Ghanaian. Or Ghanaians will say, well, I can't marry a Nigerian. Or even to break it down within Nigeria, Yorubas will say, I can't marry an Igbo person or an Hausa person. That is changing. Like, I'll give you an example. I've got a friend. We went to University of Ibadan together. His dad is a professor of Nigerian history. And there was a time he was going out with someone who was Igbo. And he said to me, Israel, I don't think I can marry this girl. And I said, why? I said, because my dad was against it. He said, your dad is a professor of Nigerian history. He should know better that we shouldn't be divided along tribes. If your dad, who is a professor of history, is saying to you, you shouldn't marry this girl because she's Igbo, then we have a big problem, that we still need to resolve. And I know, as I said, that is changing. There is more intertribal marriages, intercontinental marriages in that sense. But I think some of it is still deeply ingrained in us. That sometimes Africans, we are selfish to our own tribe. And sometimes it's actually the source of corruption for many of the governments in Africa. Because of that tribe, you build something, a dynasty around your own tribe for your own people to prosper if you come into government at the expense of other people. And so this thing runs very deep. And so if we're going to help Africa to continue to develop, we need a vision that addresses tribes, that addresses tribalism. We need to address it. And I know people are doing that, but I think we cannot ignore it. And again, this plays out in the church, in that sense. I can talk about several church denominations who have functioned on one particular tribe in that sense. And to change the leadership from that to another tribe is very problematic. And so this thing runs deep. We can't blame Europeans for all the divisions in Africa. We had our own issues before they came in that sense. So it's a challenge that we need to address in society and in church.
Sure. Thank you. Well,
I'm not done, sir. Am I privileged to...
okay, just a quick one so that we can...
Yes, sir.
Yeah, please, quick one.
Yes, well, it's a kind of... experience we are having in South Africa, let me put it that way. Maybe I should narrow it down to the experience we're having, a situation whereby a tribe, or let me say a nationality is saying this is Nigeria church, this is South African church. And it's a situation like that, you realize that the church used to be united. Suddenly, when we started to say these are Nigerians, and this is a Nigerian church, this is an Igbo church, this is Yoruba church, this is a South African church, then you realize that we are having so many churches and we are not united. And even each church now becomes mushroom places where we are not well coordinated. How do we deal with such, sir?
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, I think Dr. Israel, because that will fall under the solution you provided.
Solutions, yes.
Yeah,
No
so
problem.
maybe we move that question to that. Let's move that your response to when you want to give solution to how do we.
Okay.
Because I want for us to move to.
Okay.
Yeah. So my question to you now. Let's give our Molelekao. Sorry if I don't pronounce your name well. From Lesotho, you raise up your hand. Your question or comment?
Yes. Yes, I think this is a very, very crucial topic. I sit in the boards and focus on governance. And if you look at the governance code for South Africa, which we have adopted in Africa, they have elevated governance or corporate governance to ethical leadership and ethical culture. And this issue of culture, it's an amazing issue in corporates, especially for thriving strategy. There's a guru by the name of Peter. He says, culture is your strategy for breakfast. And it's a major issue. So it says it doesn't matter how best is your resources, how best is your strategic document. If the culture is not fit for purpose or is not aligned to your strategy, you will never achieve. So it's a burning issue on how corporates and the public sector are managed. And what we have in the corporates, you find that as it was presented, there's the intentionality around this matter to say what is defined in that particular culture that will be fit for the organization, so that any deviation that we have, we can always measure and put parameters. So I think as a church, it's very, very clear that the Bible addresses this thing of cultural shifts or norms very, very straight, because our focus is Jesus in this dispensation that we are believing in. But the big question is how, from the church point of view, first of all, are we aware of the shifts? Are we aware as a church of what needs to be done? So I think that's while the world is moving ahead on the culture issues of stakeholder inclusivity, issues of inclusion in general, but the church seems to be lacking behind. And I think that the main reason for the church, as it was highlighted, we believe in the Holy Spirit, but even our strategy as a church, because the kingdom focus is just huge, but to define as a particular church as to how do we measure this issue of culture and be intentional. I think that's a major gap that I think with this presentation, it's my takeaway call to say what should I do moving forward, as part of the denomination, while the world has moved ahead, but it's still struggling, even the world, because when you talk of culture, you're talking about the heart of God. We need to look it from the heart of God to change whatever that we are having a challenge with. I think I don't know if it's a comment or a question, but
Yeah.
I just want to highlight from the corporate governance point of view, this is the amazing issue, and this is killing, corporates. This is killing, organization. Now you find that it's hidden in the change management, it's hidden in the innovation. There's a lack of Kodak, there's a lack of Nokia, why they failed. So why organization fails. So I think it's around being trapped in the historical methods that worked in the history, but it doesn't mean that those methods will work now. So that's the challenges that organizations are facing to be agile and navigate the VUCA world. So I think that's a major issue. So I think it also reflects in the church. Thank you very much.
No, thank you. Thank you so much for I will respond to your comment as comment, and also you raise some questions. And I want to also refer these into the solution that the article of Dr. Israel have provided, and I think you will find answer there. So we still, Dr. Israel, permit me that we move it to when you are now giving the solution that you provided under the 4 rationale that you presented. Is that okay with you?
Yeah, that's fine. I'm happy to do that. Yes.
Okay, good. Because I want to give the 2 other, give them opportunity to express what they have in mind. Professor Femi, please. Then after that, Dr. Sam.
Thank you so much, Dr. Olafunjano and Reverend K. It's quite interesting that the issue you raise about cultural competency, for me, that is the key. And so that falls within the aspect of personal leadership development, to lead a cross-cultural team in terms of diversity when it comes to congregation or pastoral theology. So there are 2 things I propose, which I find very interesting. Is the competency when it comes to cultural, cross-cultural leadership development, and then cross-cultural theology, understanding of whoever that stand in front, of the congregation. I remember when I first came to the UK, I have a similar challenge, because I found out that, when someone from Zimbabwe start a church, the dominant tribe would be Zimbabweans, and the same thing with Nigerians. So one day I asked myself the question that, what's really wrong? Which I went to pray about that. And then the Holy Spirit talks to me about I should go and study Maslow hierarchy of needs. And so from that leads me to the issue of contextual theology. And for us, in terms of leadership, I believe that there is a deficiency in acquiring the skill, because cultural competency in terms of cultural theology and cross-cultural leadership is not going to come on you by the anointing. It's a skill that you have to acquire. Thank you, sir.
Thank you. I think this is quite becoming more interesting now, because it's going beyond. Okay, Dr. Sam, over to you. Your comment or question?
Thank you very much, TK, and thank you very much for such a great presentation. Obviously, I think some of my comments are going to be taken care of in the final discussion. But the thing I just wanted to observe is that since I've worked in different leadership positions where you have, multicultural teams worldwide, and I've noticed that this is a very complex issue actually, which is facing the modern church, and it's even very hard to overcome that until such forums like this one, and that's why I propose this must not be the last. We need to keep on talking, because it is the gist of the matter. We can only solve it when we talk about it. But around the whole world, the challenge is we don't talk about it. And as we don't talk about it, then it remains on the underline or hidden, and then it surfaces as we try to do relationships, as we try to work together, or even as we worship, because we have never spoken about it. But as we expose it, I think we need also to have some skills which will always, whether business or church or whatever organization, where there is room for exposing it, because it's always there. Because we cannot change that. We we're born in different places, and therefore we have different tastes because of our culture. But sometimes if I don't know what is in me, no one talks about it, I affect many people without even knowing. So I think just shortly, my take will be that we need to continue with this so that we can understand and communicate with people about this thing, and then at the same time, then the theological missional will have to include that even in our Bible schools. It should be one of the causes that is important, especially for missions and even for theology, because we see it even in the Bible. I was just 5 days in the USA, in New Mexico, and in my mind, because I was in USA, in New Mexico, I thought that it's different there. But to my amazement, the man I was visiting, staying in his home, he was, complaining like we are talking here in Africa, that the white people here came and take our farms, and he even showed me some paperwork, and there was that white supremacy right in America, someone talking exactly like as we are talking in Africa or wherever. And then I saw that this issue is broader than we can even imagine. So briefly, let me just pause there. I just wanted to say that. Thank you.
No, thank you. Thank you for your comment and your contribution. Reverend Maurice from Cordova. Reverend Maurice?
Yes, sir. Thank you so much. Good morning to everybody.
Good morning.
I'm so grateful for the time and the teaching, this interactive moment. I just want to inject the aspect of the French-speaking African or French-speaking nations. This is a major challenge, and we have a serious challenge with this in the countries that we work in. And most times they kind of put every Anglophone in a melting pot, and then they come to narrow it down to distinguishing between Nigerians, Ghanaians, and other Anglophones. And that is something that is really, well, with the charisma and the charismatic gifting of some Nigerians, Ghanaian churches that have been started in the French-speaking countries, they have some impact. But sometimes it's very, very difficult. And I've heard also some Nigerian pastors speak against the French and their attitude. And there was an apostle from Sierra Leone that we worked together in Cote d'Ivoire. And at one time I had to tell him, as the Lord led me to, you cannot hate a people and say you are ministering to them. And the police in the French countries, their attitudes are quite different. And I think that developed a kind of antagonism from the Anglophones against the French people, and the kind of it affects the influence that they have over the people. There are some who don't have time for those things and they just go on with it. But what I'm trying to get here is that it is something that the African church need to think about, especially looking at the Francophones. And the Francophones have one notion that the Anglophones want to force them, oblige them to speak their language, which is English. And they feel insulted. And sometimes it's difficult for you to really get them to give attention, because when they speak, they don't speak the French. They want them to force them to speak English, or for them to speak English for them to understand. And usually what I tell them is, if somebody came to Ghana or Nigeria or Liberia or any Anglophone country and spoke French and expected you to understand French, will you accept that? And the answer will be no. But how will we now expect that the Anglophones will the Francophones will expect us to speak their language or understand, to speak our language and understand our language? For us working in the Francophone nations, this has been a serious issue. And so some of us had to go into real struggle to really learn the French and begin to communicate. So I'm able to navigate in the different, French countries by the grace of God with the little that I know how to speak, which gets me through. But many English pastors, and that's why it even affect the impact of Anglophone pastors having, some impact on intellectuals. Because once you start breaking the French and start to speak French that does not coordinate, I mean, it's not even something to listen to, the intellectuals will immediately get somehow appalled with your preaching or your teaching. Because you are not, your French is not well spoken, it's not, it's not organized, it's not even spoken well, and you mix it with English. It brings about a lot of issues and tension. They want to hear what you are saying, but you are not making effort to learn their language even after 10, 15, 20 years. And they feel insulted that you don't care about the language, but you care about what you can give to them. And they are forced to do that with you. So I'm just bringing this to our attention. So what we've really been working on, which we'll be working mostly next year, 2026, is to start a school in Abidjan, in Cote d'Ivoire, that will do bilingual training, both in English and French. The Francophones that will attend the school in Cote d'Ivoire will come to Liberia or any of the Anglophone countries and learn and do 1.5 years of their college education. And the French, the English will go to the Cote d'Ivoire and do 1.5 the last year of their courses in the same program. And this is something we are working and praying that we can have people that will be willing to cooperate with us and do that. But I'm just saying that that's the antagonism you see everywhere you go to. And sometimes you go to places, no interpreter, the Chad. You go to places like Chad, you can't get interpreter in any other places easily. And you go to certain places, that you don't have much Anglophones or English speakers, you have a serious struggle. So I think this is a discussion that needs to be taken higher in the TK so that we can look at this more deeper, not just among the other people, but even in Africa, among Francophone and Anglophones. Thank you.
No, thank you, Reverend Morris. Yeah. Please go ahead.
Pastor Morris has raised a very that I think is worth paying attention to, because I think what we are wrestling with here, obviously, is the impact of colonization on African mind. There is one layer, but I don't want to look at it through that lens. On the issue of Anglophone and Francophone Africa, the current reality that we have, I think this is a big challenge, because even when you look at most of the textbooks, African theological textbooks, they are written in English. Even when African theology began to develop in the 1950s, the dominance was the Anglophone aspect of that. The Francophone was very strong, even though from a Catholic background, but many of them had to translate their work into English because of the dominance of the Anglophone. And so when it comes to church, again, we see that dominance in terms of the superiority of the Anglophone and the representation in conferences as well. I think I remember when we were in Dubai, one of the things that was highlighted was that we were missing a lot of Francophone African speakers in the room. In a majority world conference, it came up. And I was in Seoul, South Korea. I met a lot of Francophone pastors who came to the World Evangelical Alliance. But one of the things I see as their struggle was that as they try to relate, because obviously the conference was done in English, even though we were in South Korea, but to allow the international nature of the conference. But I saw the Francophone brothers struggling, because many of us could speak English, but they could speak only few. And I kind of feel for them. At that stage, I feel, as an African, actually, if I want to connect with my Francophone brothers and sisters, I need to learn French. I was just thinking about that in South Korea, because I think the dominance of the English language on the African mind is very serious. And I think that's part of what Pastor Morris is raising, that if we're going to do church planting, church growth in the Francophone context, we need to pay attention to the language and the context to make this impact. So again, that adds to the layer of the African context on this subject. I know if Dr. Follier was here, he probably would say more on this subject, because I know this is one of his passion. And I know others who have articulated is that we need to pay attention to Francophone African. Even in the UK, when we talk about African churches in the UK, it's the Anglophone ones that are dominant. The Francophone ones exist in the UK as well, but they are on the periphery. They are on the margins of that discussion. So I'm very much aware of the problems that this is. So thank you, Pastor Morris, for raising it.
Yeah, no, thank you. Actually, I'm glad that you mentioned Dr. Foley. He will be on this platform sometimes next year. We had a very good engagement the last 3 days because he's one of my peer review on my program. So we relate well. I think also another maybe so that we can factor that even to Reverend Morris, Lusophone need to also be considered. Though we may say that they are a minority, but they are very critical. The Lusophone also feel that they are missing, they are being not regarded. We had a meeting in Kenya 2023 that brought together under Actia, that brought together about 140 to 160 delegates from 40 countries. And I could see the struggle of our Lusophone friends, the Portuguese-speaking countries. They are struggling. And so I fully raised the same issue about how the Francophone are being undermined. But if we look statistically, looking at the Francophone countries in Africa, they are more than Anglophone.
That's the point I was going to say. I'm sorry to interrupt, but there are more Francophone nations in West Africa than even Anglophone nations. There are 4 Anglophone nations in West Africa. There are 8 Francophone nations in West Africa alone. In Africa, there are about 27 to 28, between 21 to 27 to 28 nations that are Francophone nations, and not just, that's to tell you more than half of, almost close to half of the African continent. And just what you said, just to add to that, the issue of lack of materials or teaching or training materials in French is not only in the area of theology, in science, in technology, in petroleum. As a young man I work with in Chad, he's doing his master's. To do his master's thesis, he could only find 5 books that were not even very necessary. Doing most of his thesis work. And they said to him, if you understand English, you can give you a scholarship to go to China to do PhD in petroleum, chemistry or something. But he could not even find the material. He's frustrated. He's trying to go to Nigeria in January or Ghana to learn English because he could not get his way around easily to do his thesis. Just to bring, it's not just in the math and sciences, technology and all of that. So we've neglected these people and everything is Anglophone. Thank you, sir.
Well, no, thanks for that comment. So I think you also mentioned there's this training. We can talk more about it because this is not just to raise issues, but also solution. And we need to tap into the solution that is within us. Thank you for that point. Brother David from Zambia, a quick one. If you want, please come on with a quick question as we're about to wrap up, because I still want you, Dr. Israel, to address 2 critical issues as we are wrapping up. So, Brother David, quick one. Over to you.
Thank you so much, TK. Thank you for this powerful presentation. My question is, are we dealing with the challenge of transformation? Because maybe there's a difference between transformation and integration. Because I look at Jesus from the aspect of being Jesus, he had a culture, he had a nation, but being Christ, it means he was universal. He's a universal king. And so is it the challenge of transforming from our culture to Christ consciousness? Because Christ also operated on a basis of unconditional love. And I believe unconditional love has no tribe, has no race, it doesn't see the differences among ourselves. I look at the garden, for instance, the apple, the mango, the banana. They are very different, but there is that kind of harmony in the garden. So are we dealing with having failed to really bring about genuine transformation? Because I look at the 12 disciples who had so much impact at the global level, and there was so much transformation. So is it a problem of transformation from the perspective of being at peace with my Christianity within the African culture or African context? So are we dealing with the issue of the theology, which has been distorted, maybe because of different languages, from Hebrew, for instance, to Latin, to English, to our language, which has created a distortion of who we are as Christians in the African context? Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Well, quick response to that, Dr.
Now, thank you. I think the issue of transformation is key, but I think so let's look at the theological doctrine, incarnation, which is the basis for some of this conversation. The incarnation of Jesus connected Jesus as part of the Trinity with humanity. Jesus became one of us. He connected with humanity in its frailty, in its weaknesses, but he also connected with humanity in its diversity. But also, he connected with humanity in its particularity. Jesus tabernacled among the Jewish people. He became very particular. He was Jewish. Jesus was a first century Jewish person. And, some will talk about that as the basis of contextual theology. And so when we look at the incarnation, it connects with the humanity in its generic sense, but also it connects with humanity in a specific lens. So the incarnation of Jesus has those two lenses, the particularity and the generality. And so I think for me, that includes the transformation and the integration at the same time. And so the incarnation of Jesus, in fact, I would argue, is God's cross-cultural language and competence, connecting with our humanity in a, in the generic sense, because he died for everyone. At the same time, it came to a specific culture, which means that there is something that is being highlighted there by the Godhead, that there is something about our distinctiveness. And I'll add this. So the revelation that John saw in the book of Revelation, it says, I saw multitudes. Oftentimes when I look at that passage in chapter 5 and chapter 7, one would have expected that John saw multitude worshiping Jesus. That is enough. But then why did he went on to mention specifically tribes, nations, and languages? I think it did that because I think God is interested in our particularity, because God created us and he puts us in different places for a reason. And so whether it's our skin color or our nationality, they are important. Of course, it has to be under our heavenly citizenship. We cannot we cannot say that exists on its own. Our heavenly citizenship is the ultimate, but our distinctiveness is part of our humanity and identity. And again, I think that is crucial. And we see Paul again wrestling with this. Oftentimes people will say, when Paul says to the Jews, I became a Jew, and then to the Gentile, I became a Gentile, does that mean that Paul was not secure in his identity? Paul was a proud Jew, Hebrew of Hebrews, but yet he had Roman citizenship, and he was also born in a Greek culture. In fact, it was those tripartite nature of Paul's identity that helped him to be able to plant what I would describe as an intercultural church in Antioch, which was very different from the Jerusalem church in that particular sense. So I think we need both the integration and the transformation. And I think the incarnation speaks to both.
Thank you. Thank you. There's a hand of applause for that response from you. Now, quickly, I will take you a little bit back to where we started. Then I want you to connect this with the solutions you described or presented in the article, which will respond to some of the questions being raised by some of the participants. In your article, you did mention about the three group in majority world, and they are shared from the European masters. Will you explain that? Then from there, you can move to the solution you prescribe. I just want for every one of us to understand that context of the fact that we are not the only one being shared from it past. We have each group of this majority world have their past history. Then how do we
No, thank you. Yeah, so I think the African suffering is known to us because of slavery or enslavement and colonization, but the Latin American context has its own. So what many people don't know is that when the Reformation took place, the Counter-Reformation by the Jesuits, Ignatius of Loyola, they basically went to, because at that time, Latin America was opening up. They went to conquer Latin America. They were called conquistadors. And basically what I mean is that so today we even use the term Latin America instead of America. Where did that came from? This is a residue of the past of Latin West, conquering the Italian West, conquering Latin America, hence that appendage to Americas in that sense. But when you look at the situation in Latin America, the conquistadors were the first conquering of that, where indigenous cultures were decimated, and then an implantation of the Portuguese and Spanish colonies in that particular context. And a lot of things went on, so that today you meet Latin Americans, they speak Spanish and Portuguese. That is not their language. That is a European language they speak. So while we think about Anglophones and Francophones, they are thinking Spanish and Portuguese in the context of Latin America. So again, hence Maria in Dubai talks a lot about coloniality because of that context. And then you look at the Asian context, there was a lot of partitioning that took place as well. An example is India and Pakistan in 1947. Which is still, the legacies of that still very much with us in terms of Hindus and Muslims and that ongoing tension in that sense that is there. But you look at other places, you look at Singapore, you look at Malaysia and the influence, the Western influence on those spaces. But a key thing is that what many people don't actually know is that after slavery almost ended, there was something that took over sometimes. It's called indentured servitude. This is a situation whereby people mortgage their life to service. You call it almost intentional slavery. And that happened with a lot of Asians, with a lot of Asian workers in the Caribbean. So today when you look at many people from the Caribbean, there is an Asian ancestry. That is because of indentured servitude that took place, that has a lot of Asians going to the Caribbean or to America or to other parts of the world, mortgaging their life and saying, I'm going to serve as a servant, but can you pay for my wages? Can you pay for my travel expense and those kind of things? So those contexts, I think it's very important to understand that when we talk about the majority, what we don't homogenize our suffering, our problems. They are very distinct, and creating different contextual realities for each region in that sense, which is why the solutions that we must come up with cannot be black and white. We have to respect each context. So the solutions for Latin Americans will be different from maybe what Africans will come up with, and then what Asians might come up with in that particular sense. But it's just very important to understand the suffering of other continents and the challenges that they have around some of this as well. But to begin to talk about the solutions, because I think we've talked a lot here about suffering and divisions and polarization. So I think for me, the starting point of a solution is realizing the complexity of this subject, the awareness. And I think we all realize that the awareness is very key, that this is a complex issue in different regions, in different places, and so on. So that's the first thing. The second thing is this reality that we have at the moment around several divisions, whether they are artificial or man-made creation or whatever it is. How do we, as a church, if the church is going to be prophetic in Africa and speak into this, then how do we model something of a countercultural community of God for people. In essence, how do we do church well that embraces different tribes in Africa, that embraces Lusophone, Francophone, Anglophone? How do we do that? How do we do that well? I think to do that well, we need to understand contextual theology. And there are 4 parameters around that. We need a kind of a sociological rationale as a first starting point. What I mean by that is understanding the reality. So if I take South Africa, for example, South Africa, we call it a rainbow nation. There's a reason for that. The diversity there around the different tribes that already exist, but also how society was categorized through apartheid situation is also there that we cannot ignore: white, colored, and black. That is a reality. How can we do church that embraces those parameters? And then added to that is that other African people from other African countries have moved to South Africa. And then that has created a kind of a xenophobia and a kind of a tension for strangers, because the Black South Africans are feeling, we have been suffering here for a long time. You guys are now coming to benefit from this. Where were you when we were struggling? So how do we speak into that? How does the Church of God in South Africa speak into that? I think if we're going to do that, we have to understand that sociological rationale, the parameters around the suffering of different people, whether those who have come from other African countries into South Africa, the Black South Africans or the colored South Africans and the white South Africans. How do we speak into that? How do we create a church that speaks into that? And that leads to something else, the missiological rationale. The mission of God is to go and make disciples of all nations. The command we have is not going to say, it didn't say, go and make disciple of one nation. It didn't say, go and make disciple of one tribe. It didn't say, go and make disciple of Anglophone Africans or go and make disciples of Francophone Africans. It said, go and make disciples of all nations. How do we translate that into Kenyan context, into South African context, into Zimbabwean context, into Ghanaian context? What does that mean in reality? It simply means that if I'm doing church, what is my context? Who are the people in our demographic that is missing in our church or in our organization that needs to come in? And that missiological rationale leads to the ecclesiological rationale. And that simply means that the church, the ecclesia of God, has to be radical. The church has to, the koinonia aspect of the church means that the rich were sharing with the poor. Different class system, they were sharing. And this is where the story of Barnabas as a son of encouragement came in to give everything that he had so that the different groupings that he had in the church can benefit from the system. How do we create that radical ecclesiology or organizational structure that allows each different communities to be empowered? It's very important. That is why that ecclesiological rationale is there. And then lastly is the anthropological rationale, which simply means that we think that, yes, we are all created in God's image. Imago Dei. Whether we are Francophone Africans, white South Africans, Arab Africans, Lusophone Africans, whatever way we identify, we are all created in God's image. That is the starting point of contextual theologizing. We are all created in God's image. Yet that humanity is expressed, found it, as Paul tells us in Acts chapter 17, in different ways, because it talks about from one man, God created nations in that sense. And so because of that commonality that we have, how can we do church and challenge the divisions, the polarization, the fragmentation of identity that we see in society? So our churches should become those countercultural places that actually speaks into the divisions that we see in society. But I think these are the vision that we need to catch, that, understand the sociological aspect of this, what has shifted in society, the missiological. God's mission is not about one tribe for one nation. God's mission is the house shall be called the house of prayer for all nations. So God is not a tribalist God. God is not a local God. God is not Nigerian. Folks, God is not Nigerian. even though I would love to say that. God is not South African. God is an international God. And so this is why the subject of my edited book was called Polyphonic God. The argument was that God speaks multiple languages. God speaks French, he speaks Hebrew, he speaks Arabic, because God communicates to all of us through our language. So God is international. And so because of God is polyphonic, and we see an expression of that on the day of Pentecost. And I think we need to find ways of creating that in our various contexts or organizations or wherever we find ourselves. I think those are some of the ways I think we can begin to address these issues. Thank you.